Hello, my name is James Tudge and I am the designer for Group 8, and I also took on the responsibilities of Scrum Leader. My main responsibilities for the project were level design and creation. I also took on further responsibilities such as management roles and audio work during the project as they were needed. Our game was a life sim set on Mars, created for the PS5, where the player would do chores and maintain the base, until the night when the mysterious creatures come out and terrorize the player. Before I began designing the base level and environment, I first found images and designs of other existing examples on the internet. I then created a basic shape of what I wanted the base to look like and assigned purposes to each room. Once I had finished with the shape of the base, I began working on populating the landscape around it, and then later the interior. The interior of the room was made easy to block out because I had first assigned purposes to them. I experimented with many different variants of interior designs, but in the end settled on very simple designs and floor plans, as the custom engine had a very basic movement and would not accommodate complex designs. The custom engine wasn't the only thing that influenced the layout and design of the Mars base. They were also influenced by the chores the player would be completing, as each room needed to have enough space to carry out the tasks and still feel like a lived-in environment. I also tried my best to space out most of the chores so that the player would visit most of the level by doing the bare minimum. Once the level blockout was complete, myself and the other designer worked with the artists to create a comprehensive list of all the assets we would need to fully complete the level. These assets included an assortment of hab pieces that we could use to build the habitat out of, furniture pieces to fill the rooms, and an assortment of decorative assets to fill the gaps in the rooms. This was an important step in the creation of the game, as it allowed the artists to work without the need for constant assessment from the designers. It was also a great help at managing the workload, as we were able to cut assets we deemed unnecessary. The asset list also has a priority section which lists all the assets from priority 1 to priority 5, with 1 being the most important. This influenced which assets the designers made first, with priority 5 assets being considered stretch goals. The asset list changed throughout the project. It gained additions to the priority 5 section as we completed assets faster than expected, and it changed visually quite early on from a very simple list on Microsoft Word to a comprehensive assortment on Excel. Once I had finalized the asset list, it fell to me to help assign each asset to a specific artist. I had to ensure that the number of assets each artist had was a number that they could realistically achieve by the end of each week. I also had to make sure that the asset in question required skills and ability that the specific artist had. Once the artists knew which assets they had to create, I set about finding examples of what I had in mind for the design and feeding that information to the artists. We organized ourselves this way so that the artists didn't have to constantly think about all of the assets fitting together in the level. They could just work on their individual pieces. Once the assets were created, they would send pictures to me and I would compare them to other assets and place them in the environment to see how they fit. If they didn't, I would suggest changes until the asset worked in the level. There were several examples throughout the project of alterations and improvements I requested to the assets, which were to assist in level creation. These included attaching decorational assets to the furniture they would be placed on to save myself from meticulously placing them in a rather finicky engine. And I also requested certain objects be grouped together, such as the crates in the storage room or the solar panels outside, for the same reason. Another example of me influencing the artists was the request for them to add more colour to the assets, as quite a large amount of them were shades of white and grey, which was the colour palette of all Martian bases in media, however made our level feel very dull, so newer assets now have much more colour variation. After a large portion of the assets were created, it fell to me to recreate the level I designed in Unreal, in the new engine our programmers had made. The engine we had was quite limited in what it could do. For most of the project we could only move assets by changing its translation values. This made the whole process much longer than it needed to be. We also found the issue that stairs and moving the player up and down was going to be very challenging, so we had to redesign parts of the level to work around this. So we removed all unnecessary staircases and elevations in the environment. As I previously mentioned, I requested that certain items be grouped together to save time placing them in the environment. This was only made necessary because of the translation values being the only method of moving items in the level. Once I had finished placing everything, the second part of my job arose. I had to manually create the collisions for the environment using red blocks that were easy to calculate collisions with. This whole process was necessary due to the choices made at the beginning of the project to save the programmers time creating a very complex collision system. The collision building was made even more frustrating as I still didn't have a better method of moving blocks besides the translation values. Another of my contributions was the UI design and experimentation. My goal was to design a basic heads-up display for the player that would inform them of tasks and areas of the map. It would be diegetic UI and that needed to fit with the themes of the game and style of the art. My original concepts were going to have a clock and oxygen gauge present, however the functionality of these was cut due to time and technical limitations. For the design and layout, I browsed other designs and copied styles that I felt would fit with the existing style of assets. After I had the design and layout I wanted, I tried varied colours to see which would look better against the white and orange environment. One of my later contributions was to create and record the script for the dialogue that would play at the beginning of the game and to play after completing each task. When I began writing the script, I decided that I wanted to allow myself as much freedom as possible when editing. So instead of writing out one final draft, I created many versions of each phrase, so that I could have the dialogue in the narrative change over time. For example, the longer the player plays the game, the more affectionate the AI voice is towards the player. This will be shown by the voice calling the player human or researcher at the beginning, and then slowly calling the player by their name. This was a subtle way of adding narrative to the simple morning greeting. I also wrote different versions of the day and time to show the passage of time each morning to allow the world to feel more real. I had originally planned to record the audio myself and attempted a fake, more effeminate voice. However, I was unsatisfied with the results and looked into other solutions. The first solution I found was to have an AI voice I found on the internet speak the dialogue. However, the voices I found were not suitable and quite poor quality. My second solution, and the one I chose, was to outsource the voiceover to a friend of mine who was happy to help. Once I received the audio file from them, I set about cutting it up into different files, with each sentence being a different file, so that I could cut it up together and create different dialogue as needed. I then proceeded to create 6 different morning announcements to be played consecutively. Once this had been completed, I then set about implementing the audio into the engine by assigning the morning audio files to the bed asset and the completed voice lines to the relevant task. Overall, I believe that the project was a success and that we, as a team, were able to create a brilliant game that looked and felt like you were living on Mars. If you would like to see more of my work, follow me on LinkedIn or visit my site. Thank you for watching.